Father, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for creation. We glorify your name. You who knows everything, is all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect, holy, and loving. We thank you for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ that washes us of all sin, that allows us to come before you pure and undefiled, not because of our own righteousness, because none of us are righteous, but because of your righteousness. We thank you for that. We pray that you can come and be here amongst your people today, that you can stir our hearts to desire you more, to find our satisfaction in you, to worship together, to hear the word that you're going to speak to us. May that seed be planted deep in the gardens of our heart. May it grow and bear fruit, Father, and be with us. Convict us of sin. And give us strength and encouragement for the battles in our life. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Whatever way you may choose. Good afternoon. Can we all stand, please, while I read some scripture? I'm going to be reading from 1 John chapter 4, verse 7 till the end of the chapter 21. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in him, and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. And we have seen and testify that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment. Because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment. And whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar, for he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we must have from him: whoever loves God must also love his brother. This is the word of God.
Stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard the tender whisper of love in the dead of night, and you tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am, and it's who I am. It's who I am. I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers. Only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good Father. To It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am.
Father, I thank you so much for this Sunday. God, I thank you for Father's Day. I thank you for fathers. I thank you that you are a good, good Father, Lord, and you are awesome, and you are the best Father. God, I pray that right now you would convict our hearts through this message. You would convict my heart, Lord, and that our lives would be gripped with the reality of Christ's life. God, please send your Holy Spirit upon all of us. Open up our hearts and help us live a life that glorifies and honors you. I thank you so much, and I pray this all in your name, Jesus. Please be with us today. Amen. Good afternoon, everyone. You guys may be seated, or brothers and sisters, you may be seated. Let's suppose that you are driving somewhere, and you're running late, and you're kind of, legally speeding, 80 miles per hour, the classic California highway standard, right? It's not speeding if you don't get pulled over. And you're driving, and then all of a sudden, just the traffic comes to a screeching halt, and you're stuck. And frustration starts going up. You're thinking about all the different consequences behind, being late to this place that you're going, whether it be work, school, or some errands. And as you slowly progress, you try to look forward, you pull out a little bit, you look forward, and you realize the reason it's so slow is because all 4 lanes are forced to merge into one, and the CHP are passing cars through one by one because of how bad the accident up ahead is. As you slowly stop and go, you see an ambulance try to crawl through on the right side. It makes its way up there. Eventually, it's your turn to pass the accident. And as you're passing by, you cannot help but rubberneck, and you look over to the right, and you look at the accident. The first thing you notice is the car flipped on its side. You realize, yeah, it was pretty bad. You see all the shattered glass everywhere, the plastic parts of the car scattered around the perimeter, and lastly, you notice the EMTs wheeling away a stretcher with a body bag in it. I'm sure all of us have witnessed something similar to this in our lives because we drive every day. But notice that as soon as you get through that traffic, you're no longer frustrated. You're no longer speeding. You're just driving that 65, maybe even slower. You're not distracted on your phone. You sink into deep thought about what you just witnessed. You realize that you're no different, and that could have been you just as easily. And you proceed slowly, it no longer matters as much about the fact that you're going to be late, because you realize what you just seen is so much deeper, it's so much beyond than just coming early or on time. My thesis today, my main point, is that what we believe about the past, what we believe to be true about the past, determines the way that we live in the present. Let me say that again. What we believe to be true about the past, just like that accident, determines the way we live in the present. After witnessing that accident, you stop speeding. And see, the problem is that often we lose sight of what has once happened in the past. We don't forget in the sense that we completely we're unable to recall that event. Yeah, you can recall it if someone asks you, do you remember that one time? Yeah, I remember. It's not that you forget, is you lose sight of it. And what that means is you forget about the importance or the implications of that event. And that's why all of us, naturally, most of us, begin to start speeding again the next day. We start doing, getting on our phone, texting while driving, calling, whatever. That accident is only enough for one day until we lose sight of it. And we continue along the same normal mode of operation. So what I want to do today is I want to refreshen our knowledge of Jesus and how really real he was. I want all of us to walk away being reminded again of the fact that Jesus was a real human being who walked on the same exact earth that we walk upon, who ate the same way that we ate, who talked to people the same way that we talk. I want us to be reminded about his life so that our lives may be consistent with what the implications of Christ's life are for us. Or to put it another way, we cannot believe what we read in the Bible to be true, that is, that God came to this earth in human flesh, that he lived the perfect life, that he was crucified and rose again. We can't read that and believe it to be true as a historical fact and not have that be the center of our lives. Amen? Because if that really happened, if God really walked among us, if God was one of us, then that is the most important thing that could ever happen in the history of the world besides the second coming. And it demands that our life revolve around that reality. Just look at it this way. Imagine you just hear an announcement, fire alarm goes off, and it says, evacuate the building. And there's a fire 4 rooms down. You cannot ignore that reality. You cannot ignore that fact. You either have to decide to keep sitting here or to walk out. And not deciding is a decision in and of itself. And I guarantee you, if that alarm went off, nobody would be sitting here listening to my sermon. You just say, I'll watch it online, right? Everyone's going to evacuate as fast as humanly possible. And it's the same thing with the story of Jesus. His life demands a reaction. It demands a decision. And if you believe that it has historically occurred, you cannot just keep sitting here and listening to the sermon with a fire the next room over. And if you don't believe in Jesus, I want to tell you right off the bat, I'm not here to prove absolutely to you that Jesus existed. We can give sufficient evidence, that is, the biblical Gospels, to show that he was an actual historical figure. But if you are bent on denying Jesus, then nothing will prove it to you that he existed. But if you are open to historical evidence, then the evidence provided is easily sufficient. And you see, there are people, and maybe there's some people here, and it's okay, but there are some people here that deny the fact that Jesus has even existed. And I don't know if you've had this conversation before, if you came across this idea yet, and if you haven't, you will, I guarantee you. However, what's interesting is that the same people that challenged the existence of Jesus never challenged the existence of Alexander the Great, Plato, Socrates, even though there is an overwhelmingly larger amount of evidence for Jesus than for all the rest of the people I just named combined. Why? Why aren't the existences of those people challenged? Because Alexander the Great and his life, his words, they don't challenge us. But Jesus' words and his life, it challenges our lives. Because his words put us at a crossroad where we need to make a decision. Jesus is saying there's a fire in the room next door and you have to do something about it. And if you don't want to change your life, if you want to keep sitting in the pew because it's comfortable, then one of the options is to reject the fact that Jesus even existed to begin with. So, what I want to do today is I want to give evidence for the existence of Jesus and his life, and that what the gospel said about him is true. I'm going to use the word evidence and proof interchangeably, but when I say proof, I really mean evidence, because I'm not here to prove anything to you. I'm here to show you the evidence and have you come to the conclusion yourself. So, first of all, we find that the life of Jesus is recorded in the New Testament, and it itself claims to give us truth about Jesus. So let's start with the Gospels as evidence for Jesus. Luke, as he opens up his Gospel, he makes his goal very clear. He says, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed." Luke is saying, hey, I did the study. I did the research. I want to present before you what is true about Jesus, the events that happened in his life. So the Bible itself claims to give accurate information about the life of Jesus, that he came to earth, lived the perfect life, was rejected by his own, crucified, rose from the dead, and ascended to heaven. But the question stands, what if it's not accurate? What if it has changed over time? Or even worse, what if it was written long after the life of Jesus and therefore made up or modified? Have you considered that? So the first point I want to make, and if you're a note taker, you might want to take this one. The New Testament has accurately captured what happened in the events surrounding the life of Jesus. I'll read that again. The New Testament has accurately captured or recorded the events surrounding the life of Jesus. There are many different, there's much evidence for the reliability of scriptures and the fact that they are historically accurate. And we could take an entire college course in that, and that probably still wouldn't be enough. But I just want to bring up one example for you, and that is the example of William Ramsay. William Ramsay was a Scottish archaeologist, and he was a New Testament scholar. He died in the year of 1939. Now, what's interesting about William Ramsay is that he was actually educated in the Tübingen School of Thought, which was founded by F.C. Barr, a liberal theologian. And now, why is that important to this discussion? Because F.C. Barr doubted the reliability of the New Testament. He made claims that the epistles of Paul were not actually Paul's epistles, and probably like 4 or 5 of them were actually written by Paul. The rest was just forgery by other authors. They believed that the book of Acts was written a whole century after the events in Acts had actually occurred, so in the 2nd century instead of the 1st century. Basically, they said, oh, the scripture's been modified, it's unreliable, it's a nice document, but we can't really trust it. This was the liberal thought that William Ramsay was brought up in, and he was actually a firm believer of this philosophy. Now, what's interesting is that having this, for the lack of a better word, I don't want to say the word brainwash, but having been raised up in this, he went to all the geographical locations where Acts had occurred, Asia Minor, around Turkey, around the Mediterranean Sea. And he spent his whole life conducting archaeological studies. And I'm going to paraphrase, but what he said is he literally went there to study that geography in order to prove that Acts was not written by Luke, that it was written by somebody completely different 100 years after, and that it was grossly inaccurate. He said that was literally my goal. I went in there to prove that. And what's amazing is at the end of his life, after a lifelong of archaeological discovery, Sir William Ramsay confessed that, quote, Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. At the end of his life, he was a firm believer that the New Testament was completely reliable because, in fact, he used the book of Acts to help him make archaeological discoveries when he was stuck. It's amazing, huh? And we could go on to many other examples, but I just wanted to bring up the example of William Ramsay and to wrap up this point that the New Testament has accurately captured what happened in the events surrounding the life of Jesus. The next point is that the New Testament has accurately been passed down, and it can be read with confidence that what was originally written is what we read today. That the New Testament has been accurately copied, and that we can have confidence that what we read today is what was originally written. And I won't spend much time on this, but some critics bring up the concept of the broken telephone. They say, okay, we all line up along the wall, and I'll start with a phrase, and we're going to go around, and by the end, the last person's going to have a completely different phrase. I mean, we've all played that game. And they make that point. How can the New Testament scriptures be reliable? I mean, they've changed. There's so much time has passed. And yet, that's a completely false argument because that's not how the New Testament was copied in the first place. It was copied by scribes, and this was their bread and butter. I mean, this is what they did professionally. Basically, their life and their ability to make money depended on them being able to accurately copy manuscripts, whether it was New Testament or anything else. We can know, and the earliest manuscript I believe we have is from 400 AD. And again, it matches up. The next point, New Testament documents were written shortly after the life of Christ. The New Testament documents were written shortly after the life of Christ. Now see, what skeptics will say is that the Bible was written long after the events had actually occurred, therefore it must be inaccurate. So let's go back to our example of the car accident. Say what actually happened was there was 10 cars, and it was really bad, and they piled up on each other. And if somebody were to go, say a reporter would want to write a story on that a year later, and he claimed that there was 25 cars, and in fact, the whole thing started because a helicopter crashed into the freeway, right? Of course, there would be eyewitnesses around to refute the false claims that were proposed in that news article, because it was only 1 year after the events had occurred. Now, if you were to write a news article about it 100 years later, assuming that there is nothing else documented before that, nobody would be able to tell you anything because there's no other point of reference. There will be no eyewitnesses 100 years later to refute any false claims. And yet, as we will see, the New Testament was written, at least the gospel stories were written shortly after the life of Christ, which gave time for eyewitnesses, people who were there, to be able to refute the false claims if there were any. So, let's look at the date of the writing of Acts. And I'm going to propose that the writing of Acts was written around 60 AD. And let's say Jesus was crucified in 30 AD or 33 AD, 60 AD, Acts was written, and yet there's a lot of liberal scholars who say it was written either in the 2nd century, which is 100 plus AD, or maybe even after 70 AD, right? So we'll have a timeline where we'll look at that. And let's work backwards of why it could not have been, or why it doesn't make sense that Acts was written before or after 60 AD. So for example, Acts never mentions the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that happened in 70 AD. Now you might say, well, so what? He didn't write about it. Big deal. Why is that important? He could have left off many details. But what's interesting is that Luke actually mentions in the book of Acts fulfilled prophecies. In Acts chapter 11, verse 28, he says, "And one of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius." So notice Luke, in a way to make the Christian message more valid, brings up a prophecy that was fulfilled. Now, the prophecy of the destruction of the temple is much bigger than the one we just looked at, because that was actually a prophecy made by Jesus himself. And if the destruction of the temple had occurred, you can bet money on the fact that Luke would have wanted to include that in there and said, look, we're the real deal. We're onto something. Our leader made a prophecy and it actually came true. And he was killed for making that prophecy. And yet it came true. And yet we don't see any evidence of the temple's destruction in the book of Acts. Acts leaves the impression as if the temple is still standing. So we looked at 70 AD. Let's go back to 64 AD. Interestingly enough, in 64 AD is when the persecution of Nero had begun. Nero was the emperor of Rome, and he lived from 37 to 68 AD, and he ruled from 54 to 68 AD. And he persecuted Christians exceedingly, starting around the year of 64 AD, when Rome had suffered an immense fire and the Christians were blamed for the fire. But what's interesting, again, Acts is a book that records the history of the early church, and yet there is no mention of Nero's persecution. Luke records Christian martyrs. For example, Stephen in Acts chapter 7 and James in Acts chapter 12. Luke is really good at documenting persecution, Paul's persecution that he faced, right, and other Christians. And yet, why would he leave out such a major aspect to persecution, such as the persecution by the Roman Empire itself, the ruling empire of that time? Is it possible that Acts was written before the 64 AD persecution? The next and even more interesting point is in 62 AD, there is no mention of the death of Apostle James. Now, just for clarity's sake, there are two Apostle James. One was James, the brother of John, James and John, the two, one of the two of the three favorite apostles of Jesus. And then there's Apostle James, who was actually the blood brother of Jesus. Now, James, so the first James, the brother of John, he died fairly quickly. He was executed. But Apostle James died in, the brother of Jesus died in 62 AD. Now, both of them were extremely important. And the brother of Jesus, James, was actually quoted in Acts chapter 15, he says something in Galatians 1:19, he's called an apostle by Paul. So he was an important figure in the church. And yet, why would Luke leave out his execution if it had occurred before Acts had been written? So you might ask, why is this date of 60 AD, the writing of the date of Acts, why is it important? Why are we even talking about the book of Acts? It's not even the Gospels. Well, because here's the link. In the beginning of Acts, Luke says that Acts is the second letter that Luke is writing. The first one that he wrote to Theophilus was the Gospel according to Luke, which describes Christ's life. So say if Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke 5 years before, even if it was 1 year before, that means the gospel was written or recorded around 20 to 30 years after the events around the gospel had happened, which goes back to the point I made that gives enough time for eyewitnesses to refute any false claims they might have seen in the Gospel of Luke. So just as a recap about the New Testament, is that the New Testament has accurately captured what happened around the life of Jesus. It has been accurately passed down. And the documents, New Testament documents, were written shortly after the life of Jesus, allowing time for eyewitnesses to refute any false claims. Now, before I move on to this, I do want to mention that the New Testament isn't the only writing that mentions Jesus. He's also mentioned by ancient historians who didn't believe in him. Tacitus actually spoke against him. But in speaking against him, he creates another historical data point about him. Pinley the Younger, Josephus, to name a few, they mention and even talk about his crucifixion and death, and that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. A side comment from C.S. Lewis. There are people who say that the gospel is just a legend. Right? It's just a myth. It's a fairy tale. That's all you're following is just myths, fairy tales written, and it's just like any other Roman or Greek myth about their gods and goddesses, what they do. But I love C.S. Lewis, not just because it's C.S. Lewis, but because the man really knew what he was talking about. He was a professor at Oxford, and he said, and he was actually a literature professor, and he said, I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths, all my life. I know what they are like. So if someone tells me that something in the gospel is legend or romance, I want to know how many legends and romances he has read and how well his palate is trained in detecting them by flavor. What C.S. Lewis is, he's calling him out. He's saying, look, if you want to say that the gospel is a legend, show me your credentials, because I've been studying legends my entire life, and by reading this, I know I'm too good at my job to say that the gospel, that the New Testament is a legend. So that's just a side comment that I thought was pretty cool. So next up, the next series of points were as evidences for the existence of Jesus are conversions. So let's look at the conversion of Apostle Paul. So before he became Apostle Paul, he was Saul. As you may know, he was a very, very zealous believer in Judaism. He was very passionate, and he says that he even surpassed his peers in following Judaism. He was almost obsessed about it. He had an amazing education, one of the best at that time in Judaism. He calls himself the Pharisee of Pharisees. Now, what he's not saying is, I was the hypocrite of hypocrites, because we equate those two words, right? What he was saying, the Pharisees were a ruling class at that time of Israel. And what he was saying is, I was on top of the ruling class. You couldn't go any higher in Judaism in Israel at that time. He was on his way to great religious and political influence. He was on the path of glory and success. He had it all coming for him. So from an earthly perspective, Paul had nothing to gain and everything to lose by accepting the gospel. Again, based on what he had in Judaism, he had everything. He had fame, glory, power, influence. But from an earthly perspective, he had nothing to gain by switching to Christianity, and he had everything to lose. The math simply does not add up. Let's look at what he traded all this for. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says, 5 times I have received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. He means 5 times I've been whipped with 39 lashes. He says 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Oh, man, what a deal. What a deal. Come to Jesus, give up your old life, and get this amazing package of benefits, right? The math simply does not add up. Unless, I think the logical conclusion is here, unless he had truly met Jesus. Unless something supernatural had happened to him on that Damascus road when he met Jesus and he accepted the gospel and he rejected everything he had going for him and took up on this life of denying himself. Now, some people might say, well, it could have just been a hallucination. He had a hallucination, he had a religious experience. There are plenty of people who have religious experiences and they're Muslims and they devote their life to this religion. But what's interesting is Paul didn't just have a religious experience, a little vision, and then he continued to live his life for Jesus. Paul had that vision of Jesus, and then he met with eyewitnesses who witnessed the resurrected Christ, such as Peter and the other apostles. So his vision was actually confirmed by eyewitness accounts. It wasn't simply a religious experience, a hallucination that he had, from some mushrooms he found on the Damascus road. He wasn't just hungry. The next point. So first, the conversion of Paul is a strong testimony. It's a strong witness of the reality of Jesus. The second one is that all the apostles died for what they believed in. And you might say, well, Peter, there's a lot of people that die for what they believe in. And I agree. I can name an example. May 31st, there was a suicide bomber in Pakistan driving a motorcycle, blew himself up. His body parts were scattered all over the road. There's a video online. You guys can watch it. Does that mean Islam is true as well because he died for it? No. Because there's a very important difference. Look at it this way. If that suicide bomber lived back in the 7th century, at the time of Muhammad, when Islam was starting out, and he knew for certain that Muhammad was not a prophet of God, and that he never performed any miracles and so on, he would have not strapped himself with those explosives and blew himself up, because he would have known that Islam is a false belief. It is a lie. Here's the key point. nobody willingly dies for what they know is a lie. Nobody willingly dies for what they know to be a lie. Because your life is the most precious thing in your life. And you can give up anything but your life, because your life is, that's it. Once you give your life up, you give up everything. And any benefit you might receive from lying won't really benefit you after you die. That kind of makes sense? So nobody willingly dies for something they know is a lie. So if Jesus never existed, or if he never rose from the dead even, then that means the apostles had conspired together and spread something that they knew was a lie. But we know that people can't die for something they know is, for in fact, a lie. And yet, according to church tradition, all the apostles, with the exception of Apostle John, were martyred for believing in Jesus. So 10 of them were martyred for believing, for supposedly died for a lie. It just, again, the math does not add up without Jesus in the equation. And related to this is something had transformed the apostles. When we read the Gospels, it's very clear that the apostles were full of doubt and fear, which explains their cowardly behavior, right? We can all relate to this. Remember when Jesus was captured in Matthew 26, they all fled in fear. In John 20, they went into hiding. In Luke 24, they lost hope. They said, we were hoping this man would save us and, save Israel and he would be the Messiah. They literally, their hope had died when Jesus was crucified. Peter rejected him, denied him 3 times before he was even crucified. These people are cowards. And yet then we read later in Acts that they faced persecution for the name of Jesus with joy. They faced persecution with joy. And as mentioned before, most of them died for the faith. It's almost as if we are looking at 2 different groups of people here. Complete cowards on one hand and courageous Christ followers on the other hand. One cannot help but ask, what happened? What is it that such a big group of people, again, it's not 1 or 2 people that ate some mushrooms. It's a group of 10, 11 people who, stable men who, it's not just like there's a youth conference and they got a bunch of 12-year-olds and they hype them up and it says, go give your life to Jesus. And they gave up their lives to Jesus without knowing better. These were grown, stable men with families. And we see them being cowards, and then all of a sudden we see this transformation. And it just does not make sense. It doesn't add up unless it was the resurrection and witnessing the resurrection that had transformed their lives. The most logical conclusion is that the resurrection had changed them permanently. And similarly to this, kind of last point of this main point is that we see the conversion of Jesus' own family. Initially, his own family thought he was out of his mind. We read in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, when Jesus comes up and starts preaching, it says, and when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. As imagine growing up with Jesus, like a perfect person. It's mind-boggling because I'm really confident that they thought he was just weird. Because if you grow up with a perfect person, it's going to be really weird because nobody else is perfect. And he's just so different. And they literally thought he was insane. They just thought he was out of his mind. They thought he was weird. They thought he was insane. They were ashamed of him. They mocked him. They made fun of him. They said, oh yeah, why don't you go out into the feast and present yourself? Maybe people will believe in you then. They did not believe in Jesus, his own family. And yet we see that after his death, they also gave up their lives for his sake. The Jewish historian Josephus reported that the Jewish leaders had stoned James, that is the author of the letter of James, and the brother of Jesus. So we see his brothers going from not believing to actually worshiping him as God and giving up their life for his sake. Again, the math does not add up without Jesus in the equation. And lastly, my last point, and I'll recap right now. We looked at the New Testament and that it is reliable, that it is accurate, that it has been passed down accurately. It was written shortly after the gospel events. We looked at the comment of C.S. Lewis on legends. We looked at the conversion of Paul, the transformation of the apostles, and the fact that they all died for what they seemed to be as true. We've seen the conversion of his family. But lastly, I think all these points that I mentioned, they're good and they're useful. But I think the most powerful and the most practical point, the most powerful evidence for Jesus are the words of Jesus himself. When Philip found Nathanael, and he told him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." And that's what I want to invite you to do, is to come and see Jesus himself. Because the way that Jesus talks, the way that he had carried himself, the way that he had behaved, and the things that he did are unlike anyone else. When you read the Gospels with an open mind, you realize people could not have created or thought up of this character, because he is outside of this world. A human mind cannot create this perfect character that acts in ways that you do not expect. It's amazing. I love the example of when the Pharisees told the guards to go and arrest Jesus. So they were sent to arrest him. They come up to him, they hear him talk, they turn around, they walk back to the Pharisees, and they said, "Why did you not arrest him?" They said, "No one has ever talked like this man before." Can you believe that? Just imagine a soldier like Navy SEALs who have been trained to obey at command. Imagine the President of the United States telling them to go arrest Pete, right? And so Navy SEALs storm in here, and Pete's given his message, and just the way he preaches, the things that he says, all of these trained men who obey until the point of death turn around, go back to the president, and he says, "Why have you not arrested him? How hard could it have been?" And they said, "No man has talked like him before." How powerful his words were. So this is why I'm convinced that the most powerful evidence, and yes, I agree that this is subjective evidence or from experience, but it's powerful. And I encourage you to try it. I encourage you to come and see for yourself. Read his words, as one preacher says, that Jesus is self-authenticating. You realize that the way he talks, he must be true. He is real. So if you're still questioning whether Jesus existed, or if what is written about him is true or not, or if he really is who he says he is, I encourage you to come and see for yourself. Open up any of the Gospels and just start reading, and you'll see how Jesus will reveal himself to you. So in conclusion, we looked at the New Testament, that it's accurate, that it has accurately captured what is written, what has happened in the life of Jesus and what happened after, that it was accurately passed down. We have looked and seen that it was recorded shortly after the life of Jesus, and it can be trusted. We looked at the conversion of Paul. We looked at the transformation of the apostles, and that they gave up their lives for something they seemed to be true. We looked at the conversion of his family. And lastly, we looked at the evidence of come and see yourself, that Jesus is self-authenticating. In conclusion, if you do not yet believe in Jesus, whether if he existed or not, or if he was who the Bible claims that he was, I want to ask you, how much honest thought have you given to the fact that this might be true? And because if this is true, this changes everything. This transforms everything. Have you considered all the evidence that has been presented to you? Have you researched this evidence on your own? And I know it might be frightening, scary, uncomfortable to venture into these questions, but I guarantee you, I promise you that you will be very pleasantly surprised if you are honest with yourself on this. If you are a believer in Jesus, if you identify yourself as a believer in Jesus, my question to all of us today is, does your life revolve around the reality of Jesus coming into this earth, dying for us, being raised on the third day, and ascending to heaven? Does your life revolve around this? Because if it's true, then it changes absolutely everything about the way we ought to live our lives. Every single part of our lives. And if your life does not revolve around this fact, around the fact that God came into this world, then what does it revolve around today? What takes up your thoughts? What fills your heart? Or put it another way, what dictates your goals? What are your goals? What are your dreams? What are your desires? What do you want most out of life? And is Jesus at the center of that? Is it Jesus or is it something else? Do you just follow this Jesus thing and just have it be a nice part of your life on Sundays so that your kids could grow up well and be moral, well-behaved people? Do you follow Jesus just because of some benefits you get of, the social aspects of being in church? There's friends here, the good people, it's great. Is that why you follow Jesus? Because if that is, then that's not the center of your life. The center of your life is just being social. Do you think that you can get some kind of benefit from following Jesus, or is he truly the center of your life and your life revolves around him? What dictates your goals, your dreams, your desires? Is it him, or is it someone or something else? That's my question to all of us today.
Above all powers, above all kings, above all nature and all created things, above all wisdom and all the ways of man, you were here before the world began. Above all kingdoms, worship as we have our free will offering. Your spirit hovers over my waters. Your love burns longer than the sun. The skies of thunder echo your wonder. Your praises can't be oversung. Your spirit hovers over my waters. Your love burns longer than the sun. The skies of thunder echo your wonder. Your praises can't be oversung. The whole universe a witness, totally a part of what you've done. So let me rediscover you and breathe in me your life anew. Tell me of the God I never knew. Oh, let me rediscover you. You see my weakness, my pride, my blindness. You wield your power through them all. Of all the mysteries, the greatest to me is that you're faithful when I fall. How can I say I know you when what I know is still so small? So let me rediscover you and breathe in me your life anew. Tell me of the God I never knew. Oh, let me rediscover you. Let me cry, holy, holy, holy. Let me awaken to your majesty and see a glimmer of your glory. Let me abide in you. So let me rediscover you, and by your grace I'll follow through. Reveal to me the God I thought I knew. So let me rediscover you and breathe in me your life anew. Tell me of the God I never knew. Oh, let me rediscover you. Tell me of the God I never knew. Jesus, let me